I remember the first time I realized something was wrong. It was a Thursday, just after 9 p.m., and I was sitting in my office going through vendor invoices when I heard her laughter echo from the hallway, my wife's laughter, sweet and sharp like glass breaking, but instead of warming me the way it used to, it chilled my spine because I knew I was alone in the house, or at least, I thought I was. I stepped out, quietly, not wanting to startle anyone or maybe not wanting to face what I already knew deep down, and I followed the sound to the guest room, which we hadn't used in months. The door was slightly open, just enough to see shadows moving, whispers, and then, silence. I didn't open the door, I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I just backed away and went down to the kitchen like a coward, made myself a drink I didn't want, and sat at the marble island trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe the TV was left on, maybe it was a video call, but deep inside me something shattered, something old and sacred. When she finally came down, her hair was different, messier, her lipstick faintly smudged like she'd kissed someone in the dark and tried to wipe it off quickly. She looked at me, surprised, maybe even a little guilty, but she said nothing, just poured herself a glass of wine and sat across from me, humming some tune like we were strangers at a piano bar. And that's when I saw it, the necklace. It was silver, thin, delicate, the kind I knew I hadn't bought her, the kind I knew didn't come from me. It was too modern, too youthful, too intimate, and the way she touched it while she drank her wine told me everything. I didn't say a word that night. I just nodded to myself, stood up, and walked away from the woman I had built a life for, the woman I had loved since college, the woman I had sacrificed for, defended, forgiven, adored, even when she didn't deserve it. See, I'm not a perfect man, I'm not even a particularly kind one, but I gave her everything, every year of my prime, every dream I buried in favor of hers, every late night at the firm so she could open her boutique, every business connection I leveraged to get her store into high-end circles, every dollar I invested into her brand, her image, her success. And she gave her heart, her body, her laughter, to someone else. The next day I followed her. I didn't want to be that man, the kind that hires private investigators or checks phones in the middle of the night, but when I saw her get into a silver BMW parked 3 blocks away instead of her usual SUV, when I watched her kiss a man who couldn't be more than 26, with slick hair and a gym-built body, my whole world folded in on itself like a burned map. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just watched. And that's the worst part, when betrayal isn't loud or sudden, but quiet, slow, a kind of drowning where no one hears you go under. I filed for divorce 2 weeks later. I told her I knew, and for the first time in years, she didn't even pretend to deny it. She looked at me, tired, like I was an old chair she wanted to throw out but didn't have the heart to, and she said, "We've been over for a long time, David." I wish she'd screamed, I wish she'd begged, I wish she'd denied it just to give me a reason to fight, but she didn't. She just sat there, calm and cruel, sipping her iced tea like we were discussing the weather. And that's when I knew, this wasn't about love, or lust, or even boredom. It was about power. We built our wealth together, but I'd kept most of it under joint ventures, our names side by side, trusting that what was mine was hers, that we were a team, that marriage meant something, but she knew exactly how it all worked, she knew the loopholes, the judges, the game. She came after everything. In court, she painted me as controlling, absent, emotionally distant. She claimed I'd used her name to secure business loans, that I'd manipulated her into signing contracts she didn't understand. She brought in friends I hadn't seen in years to testify that I was arrogant, aggressive, cold. The judge, his name was Alan Mercer, I'll never forget it, sat through every lie with a polite face, never once questioning the absurdity, and when the verdict came down, it felt like I'd been hit with a train I never saw coming. She got the house, the business, the cars, even my name was dragged through the mud in local media. I was left with a small apartment above a laundromat and a savings account that couldn't even cover the legal fees. People say divorce is like death, but they're wrong. Death has dignity. Divorce, especially one like mine, is like watching someone bury you alive with a smile on their face and a crowd cheering them on. But here's the thing. Pain is a better teacher than comfort, and betrayal is the fire that forges something stronger than steel. I spent the first month waking up on a couch that smelled like mold and broken dreams, eating instant noodles, and going through old pictures like a grieving widower, but somewhere between the insomnia and the humiliation, something changed. I stopped caring about what I'd lost. And started thinking about what I could take back. That's when I remembered an idea I'd shelved years ago, a logistics optimization firm for small luxury brands, something I'd pitched once to her team and they'd laughed off, but I knew it had potential, and more than that, her boutique relied on supply chains that were clunky and overpriced. I started building again. With borrowed money, cheap coffee, and 2 college interns who barely knew what they were doing, I rented a basement office and started calling everyone who still took my number. Most people said no, a few said maybe, but one said yes, a small candle brand run by a single mom out of Oregon, desperate for cheaper transport options without sacrificing class, and when we pulled it off, got her shipments out on time, under budget, and with packaging that looked straight out of Vogue, she told everyone. Word spread like wildfire. 6 months in, we had 10 clients, a real office, and a buzz that couldn't be ignored. And that's when it happened, her name popped up in a meeting. One of our new clients had been approached by her brand, offering a partnership, and they asked me if I knew anything about them. I didn't blink, didn't flinch, I just said, they're outdated. You'll be better off with us. And just like that, the game had changed. She took my life, my money, my pride. Now I was going to take her empire. There's something strange about starting over in a space that doesn't carry your past, something both freeing and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff with nothing behind you and nothing below, just the sky and the wind whispering things you're not sure you're ready to hear. My new office was in a converted warehouse on the west side, the walls still smelled like sawdust and rust, and the old wooden beams creaked when the wind hit just right. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what I was used to, but it was mine, and after everything I'd been through, that meant more than I could explain. Every morning I walked into that space with coffee I brewed myself, sat at a second-hand desk with a dent the size of a fist in the corner, and I built something with bare hands, broken pride, and stubborn willpower. The interns, Jordan and Eli, were too young to fully understand what they were witnessing, but they believed in the idea, or maybe they just believed in my anger, my quiet determination, the way I never raised my voice but made it clear failure wasn't an option. We weren't just creating a logistics firm, we were building an ecosystem, a boutique backend for luxury indie brands that couldn't afford big players but needed elite service. We focused on speed, beauty, and control. We gave them sleek dashboards, customizable tracking, minimal packaging that screamed class, and we undercut the bloated systems everyone else was using. It wasn't long before we started eating into her territory. Not intentionally at first, but when her name came up in meetings, I stopped looking away, stopped pretending I was above it, and started asking questions, digging, watching. Her flagship store in Soho had downsized its inventory, one of her French distributors had pulled out, and I knew why. It was the same distributor now working with us, drawn by lower rates and better fulfillment times. But the moment I knew we were becoming a threat was the morning I got a cease and desist. Typed on thick, expensive paper, with a golden logo I once helped her design, the letter accused us of mimicking her brand's design language, of poaching her suppliers, of engaging in unethical business practices. I read the whole thing once, then again, then laughed so hard I spilled coffee on the edge of my laptop. It was her handwriting at the bottom, she'd signed it herself. And just like that, I knew she was watching me too. Later that night, I went for a walk around our old neighborhood, not out of nostalgia but something closer to strategy. I wanted to see how far she'd fallen, or how far she thought she hadn't. The boutique looked the same from the outside, maybe even better, new window displays, soft lighting, a scent of vanilla and jasmine wafting onto the street, but inside it felt hollow. The staff didn't recognize me, or maybe they did and pretended not to. Either way, I walked around like any other customer, hands in my pockets, eyes scanning every shelf, every tag, every little overpriced item she used to design on napkins in our kitchen. Then I heard her voice. She was in the back, giving instructions to someone, and I could tell from the tone she was unraveling, her calm, curated elegance cracking under the pressure of something she couldn't control. I didn't stick around, I didn't want confrontation, not yet. I just left, walked down 2 blocks, turned a corner, and smiled to myself because for the first time since the divorce, I wasn't angry anymore, I was focused. And I had plans. We launched our first direct-to-consumer tool a month later, a plugin that allowed our brands to track shipments in real time, with personalized updates and unboxing experiences designed to create loyalty through storytelling. It was small, maybe even gimmicky to some, but it worked, and the feedback was electric. People posted videos, tagged us on social media, and suddenly we weren't just a logistics company, we were a quiet revolution happening beneath the skin of luxury retail. And then came the gala. Every year, the Chamber of Design and Commerce hosted a black tie event at the Midtown Hilton, an excuse for CEOs and founders to pat each other on the back, drink aged whiskey, and pretend they were still edgy entrepreneurs and not aging capitalists with designer watches. I didn't plan to go, until I saw her name on the speaker list. Camille Rhodes, founder, Rhodes Atelier. It hit me like ice water, not because I missed her or cared about her speech, but because I knew this would be the perfect moment, the perfect storm. I called in every favor I had left, borrowed a tux, and showed up with Jordan, who cleaned up better than I expected, and Eli, who looked like he was going to throw up the entire time. The ballroom was gold and glass and noise, and when I walked in, I felt the tension ripple through the air like static. People whispered, stared, smiled awkwardly. And then I saw her. She looked stunning, as always, that was never in question, long black dress, diamond earrings I once insured myself, and that same silver necklace that had started this whole unraveling. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then she turned away, laughing at something a man beside her had said, a man I didn't recognize but instantly hated. The night wore on, the speeches were long and full of nonsense, but when she took the stage, I listened, not because I cared but because I wanted to know who she'd become, what story she was telling the world now. She spoke about innovation, partnership, legacy, words that felt hollow now, coming from someone who had destroyed every one of those things in her own life. And then, without naming me, she made a comment about opportunists who ride the coattails of better ideas. I didn't flinch. Instead, I waited until the networking hour, walked up to the event coordinator, and introduced myself as the founder of Ardent Supply Company, our new name, bold and sharp and nothing like hers, and I asked if they had a slot for a closing remark next year. They said yes. That night, as I walked back through the snow with Jordan and Eli behind me, I realized something that made my chest tighten and my breath catch. I didn't want her back, I didn't want revenge anymore, I wanted to win. Not to hurt her, but to remind myself I was never the failure she painted me to be. To prove that a man can lose everything, be dragged through the dirt, spat out by the courts and the woman he loved, and still rise. Because the truth is, you don't really know who you are until you've lost everything you thought mattered. And once you do, once you stand in that silence, alone and burning, you realize what's left is the real you, the unbreakable part. And that's where I was headed now. Not toward her, but toward the man I was always supposed to become. I didn't hear from her for weeks after the gala, not a single email, text, legal threat, or one of those passive-aggressive statements she used to master so well, and that silence was louder than anything she could have said. Because Camille, she didn't stay silent when she was winning. She only went quiet when she was bleeding. And I knew, deep in the quiet part of me that still knew how she moved and thought and planned, that something was unraveling behind her polished smile. That made me more cautious than ever, because the more desperate she got, the more dangerous she could become. I spent most of my days buried in client calls, supply chain meetings, code testing, back-end design improvements, anything that kept my hands moving and my mind just distracted enough to avoid spiraling. But late at night, when the office was quiet and Eli had gone home and Jordan was passed out on the couch with his shoes still on, I'd sit by the window with a black notebook and try to map it all out, the revenge she was probably building, the pieces she still had left on the board. One name kept coming up, Anthony Bell. The man from the gala, the one with the too perfect suit and the fake laugh. He wasn't just some date, he was a silent investor, someone who'd funded a chunk of Camille's expansion last year when her profits started dipping and her brand couldn't survive on perfume and name recognition alone. Anthony had deep pockets and no conscience, and that combination had always made men like him dangerous in boardrooms and worse in courtrooms. I figured he'd be the next one to take a swing at me. And I was right. It started small. One of our delivery vans was ticketed for parking in a legal zone, then the warehouse had a surprise inspection from the fire department, then our merchant processor froze a week's worth of payouts for unusual activity. It wasn't random, it wasn't bad luck, it was a message. But I didn't blink. Because I had learned something in the ashes of that divorce that no one teaches you in business school: when someone thinks you're too broken to fight back, you become the most dangerous kind of opponent. So I fought, not with fists or lawyers or money, but with precision. We doubled down on the things her brand couldn't do anymore: authenticity, speed, flexibility. I started meeting directly with brand owners, young founders who were scared of getting eaten alive by people like her, and I didn't sell them services, I sold them survival. We're not just another logistics company, I'd tell them, sitting across sticky cafe tables and co-working desks that smelled like cold pizza and ambition. We're the ones who know what it's like to be underestimated. And they believed me, because I wasn't selling them a dream, I was telling them the truth. Meanwhile, Camille was still putting out polished press releases, still posing in magazines that quoted her like she'd invented elegance, but behind that was fear. I could feel it in the sudden sales she started offering, in the influencer campaigns that looked more desperate than curated. And then came the message that stopped me cold. It was from a blocked number, but the tone was unmistakable. All it said was, "You think you're winning, but I still have the judge. I always will." My hands went cold. I stared at the screen for a long time, then locked the phone and walked outside, the winter air hitting me like a slap. It had been months, almost a year now since that courtroom humiliation, since I watched her walk out with everything I built while I was still paying the lawyer who hadn't saved me. I told myself I didn't care anymore, that I'd moved on, that revenge wasn't the goal, building something better was. But standing under a flickering street lamp, breath visible in the cold, I realized I hadn't let it go, not really. And now she was reminding me that no matter how much I built, she still had the power to burn it all down. Or at least, she thought she did. That night, I called a friend from college, Marcus, who worked in compliance at a private equity firm, a quiet guy who'd always had a thing for finding cracks in systems no one thought to look at. I asked him a question I never thought I'd ask. How hard is it to track money movement between a boutique brand and a state judge? There was a pause, then a low whistle. That depends, he said. You want to prove something. Or just scare someone into thinking you can. Both, I said, eventually. The next few weeks blurred into long days and longer nights. We grew faster than we could handle, clients doubling, orders stacking, infrastructure bending under the weight of success we hadn't fully prepared for. But we kept going, and I made sure our name showed up wherever hers did, not just in the background, but louder, faster, smarter. At one point, we won a sustainability award she'd been nominated for 3 years in a row, and she didn't even attend the ceremony. People noticed, clients whispered, headlines started comparing us directly. And that's when she called me. I hadn't heard her voice since the divorce hearing, and hearing it now felt like driving past the house you grew up in, familiar and hollow at the same time. "Congratulations," she said, no warmth in the word, only cold calculation. "You really have learned how to build something without me." "I had a good teacher," I said, flat. She laughed, sharp and tired. "Let's not pretend you're innocent, Michael. You didn't walk away, you waited, and then you struck." "I didn't destroy your business, Camille," I said, calmly. "You did that when you started building on lies." There was a pause, then a change in her tone. "You don't know everything," she said, quieter. "You don't know what it took for me to survive after I chose him." "I do," I said, "because I've been surviving too." Silence stretched between us, and for a second, I almost felt sorry for her, for the version of herself she couldn't let go of. But then she said something I didn't expect. "I want out." "Out of what?" I asked. "Out of Rhodes Atelier, out of this war, out of pretending I care more than I do," she said, her voice shaking now. "I want to sell, quietly, before the market realizes I've already lost." I didn't say anything. "I want you to buy it," she added, "make it disappear, fold it into your empire, call it mercy if you want." It wasn't mercy, not really. But it was a moment I'd imagined 1,000 times in the dark, her asking me for help, for peace, for a way out. And I wasn't sure what felt more powerful, the fact that I could say yes, or the fact that I could say no. I didn't answer right away. I let her words hang there between us like smoke in a burned-out room, because the part of me that had once loved her, truly, blindly, and maybe even stupidly, wanted to say yes, to buy her out, end this cold war and finally breathe again. But the part of me that remembered the courtroom, the fake tears, the way she clutched her pearls like I'd betrayed her while I lost everything, that part wasn't ready to let her off the hook, not yet. "Why now?" I asked finally, my voice low, calm, but pulsing with questions underneath. "Why sell now, when you spent a year tearing me apart in court just to keep what you're now trying to walk away from?" She was quiet. I could hear her breathing, but her silence wasn't arrogant this time, it was wounded, careful. "Because I'm tired," she said eventually, "because I thought I could win this, thought I could build something that made it all feel worth it, what I did, what I said in court, but I was wrong." I laughed, sharp and bitter. "You mean Anthony didn't turn out to be your prince?" She didn't deny it, didn't defend him, and that silence told me more than any insult could. "He pulled funding," she said flatly, 3 weeks ago. Said I was too volatile for long-term investment. "And the judge?" I asked, "Still in your pocket?" "No," she said, almost a whisper now, turns out, he got promoted, and his replacement isn't nearly as loyal. That surprised me, I'll admit it, because for so long it felt like she had a net made of steel and secrets, a fortress of favors no one could break through. But power is a strange thing, fragile when you need it most. I stared at the city outside my office window, lights blinking like fading stars, and I realized I was no longer angry, at least not the way I used to be. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake anymore. I wanted closure, peace maybe, or just the ability to wake up in the morning and not think of her at all. I'll consider it, I said, but if I do this, Camille, I don't want your name anywhere near the brand ever again, not in fine print, not in footnotes, not even in whispered industry gossip. Done, she said quickly, too quickly, like she'd rehearsed this. And the money? I asked. You're not exactly in a position to make demands anymore. I'm not asking for much, she said, just enough to walk away clean, pay off the remainder of the lease, maybe take a few months off in Europe and remember who I was before I became this. I nodded slowly, though she couldn't see it, and said, send me the numbers. If they're reasonable, I'll wire the funds by the end of next month. When I hung up, I felt strangely hollow, like I'd been preparing for a war that ended without a final battle, no last explosion, no clear winner. Just two people standing in the rubble of what they'd built and burned. Over the next few days, her lawyer sent over the paperwork, clean, efficient, no legal traps, no sneaky clauses, and I could tell she'd written part of it herself, because in the margins were notes in her handwriting, little clarifications, reminders to keep it fair. It was the most honest thing she'd given me in years. I signed, wired the funds, and just like that, Rhodes Atelier was mine, not to keep, but to dismantle, to erase, to make room for something newer, better, something mine. I didn't gloat, I didn't call her to rub it in, I didn't post anything online. But when the news leaked, as it always does in circles that thrive on gossip and quiet power shifts, people noticed, and clients who had once sworn loyalty to Camille suddenly started knocking on my door. It felt like poetic justice, but not in the loud, cinematic way people imagine revenge to be. It felt quiet, earned, like the slow thaw of ice around a broken heart. One night, a few weeks later, I was walking back from a late dinner meeting, tie loose around my neck, when I passed by a window display that used to feature her brand, massive posters of Camille in white silk and flawless skin, now replaced by a young startup's edgy, unfiltered campaign. It made me smile, but not because she was gone. Because I wasn't. I got home that night and found an email from someone I hadn't heard from since the trial, Natalie, my old assistant who had left quietly during the worst of it, saying she didn't want to take sides. She'd written, I heard about the buyout. I hope this means you can finally sleep again. I never believed the things they said about you, Michael. I was just scared. If you ever need someone on your team again, I'm in. I stared at that email for a long time, not just because it meant someone believed in me, but because it reminded me that even in betrayal, there are people watching, quietly, waiting to see who you become when the smoke clears. I called her the next morning, offered her a position, and by the end of the week, she was back, stronger, wiser, and fiercely loyal. With Natalie running logistics and Jordan heading up partnerships, we finally had the structure to scale fast, and in 6 months, we opened 2 new fulfillment centers on the West Coast, doubling our revenue and cutting shipping times in half. We were no longer the underdog, we were the threat. And Camille. She did go to Europe, or so I heard, stayed in Tuscany for a few months, then Paris, then disappeared from the news cycle entirely. Part of me wondered if she ever regretted it, not just the affair, not just the lies in court, but all of it, the way she tried to win by destruction instead of growth. But I never called her again, never checked her socials, never reached out, because the truth was, I didn't need anything from her anymore, not her apology, not her approval, not even her pain. I was done carrying her ghost. One day, I sat in my new office, sunlight pouring across the desk, and realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore, not even a little. Because I had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me, and turned it into the reason I became everything she thought I couldn't be. Not bitter. Not broken. But better. I hadn't thought about Camille in months, not really, not since I signed the last document and watched her name disappear from every contract, every website, every press mention we'd once shared like co-owners of a shared lie. But sometimes the past doesn't knock when it returns, it breaks in quietly, like a shadow through a broken window. It was early fall, the air in Manhattan shifting from warm to crisp, when Natalie walked into my office with a look I hadn't seen in her eyes since the court days, that mix of anxiety and something else, disbelief, maybe, or fear. "She's here," Natalie said quietly. I didn't ask who, some part of me already knew, like my body recognized the tremor before my mind caught up. I looked up from my screen, blinked once, and asked flatly, "Here where?" "In the lobby," she said, "no appointment. Just walked in, asked if you had a minute." "Michael, she looks different." "She looks." I stood slowly, my heartbeat dull and heavy, not racing, but pressing, like the weight of something I thought I buried. "I'll come down," I said, already moving. I found her sitting on one of the leather benches in the waiting area, not in designer heels or tailored silk, but in jeans, a light sweater, hair pulled back, no makeup, no jewelry, nothing to signal Camille the brand, only Camille the woman I used to wake up beside. She stood when she saw me, hesitant, unsure, and that was strange in itself, because Camille had never been unsure a day in her life. "Hey," she said softly, "I wasn't sure you'd see me." I nodded, tight, professional, motioned toward the side conference room, one of the glass ones we used for media meetings and quick check-ins. Inside, I closed the door, sat down across from her, folded my hands, and said, "Why are you here, Camille?" She exhaled, slow and heavy, like she'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, and still didn't know how to begin. "I thought I was fine," she said. "After the buyout, I went away, tried to reset, tried to find peace or meaning or something that didn't have your name on it." "And did you?" I asked, maybe too sharply, but I didn't care. "I thought I did," she whispered, "but the truth is, Michael, I've been running. From guilt. From failure. From the one person I never really wanted to lose." There it was. The thing I never thought I'd hear. The thing that should have come years ago, before courtrooms and betrayals and bribes. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," she said, quickly, "not money, not a second chance, not even forgiveness. I came because I need to tell the truth. To you. One time. All of it." I leaned back slowly, said nothing, just waited, because I could tell she meant it, and whatever she had to say, whatever truth had haunted her enough to bring her through these doors, it mattered to her. "I started the affair before the business even launched," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I told myself it was harmless, that I was still committed to you, that it was just stress, an escape, and Anthony, he made me feel powerful, like I didn't have to be your shadow. I didn't flinch, didn't move, just listened. It hurt, yes, but it didn't break me, because I wasn't the same man anymore. But when the business started doing well," she continued, "he pushed me, said I didn't need you, that I could do it without you, and I believed him, because some part of me wanted to prove I wasn't just a Michael's wife with a pretty face." Her hands trembled now, resting on the glass table, and I remembered those same hands signing away everything I had built. "When we got to court," she said, "he told me to go for blood. Said if I didn't, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. I didn't realize he meant my soul would rot slowly from the inside out." There were tears in her eyes now, real ones, not courtroom theatrics, not crocodile sobs for sympathy, just raw regret. "I bribed the judge because I was scared I'd lose," she admitted, "scared that after everything, I'd walk away with nothing and you'd walk away as the victim." "But I was the victim," I said, my voice finally rising. "You slept with someone behind my back, Camille, and then you decided to ruin me in court to protect your ego." "I know," she said, quietly, "and I live with that every day. I wake up with it, Michael. I see your face every time I close my eyes and wonder how I let it all rot like that." I stood then, walked to the window, tried to get air even though the room was fully ventilated. "So why now?" I asked, not turning. "Why are you really here?" She was quiet for a long moment, then said something I didn't expect. "I'm sick." I turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw it, beneath the sweater, the weight loss, the drawn lines under her eyes. "I didn't come to ask for help," she said again, I didn't want the last thing between us to be a lie." I sank back into the chair, stunned, confused, furious and heartbroken all at once. "What is it?" I asked. "Lymphoma," she said softly, "stage 2. I'm getting treatment, but it's aggressive, and it's made me realize how short life really is. I don't want to die without saying I'm sorry, Michael. I'm so sorry, for everything." There was no script for this moment, no moral clarity or easy resolution, just two people sitting across from years of pain, loss, betrayal, and something that still ached like love. I nodded slowly, ran a hand through my hair, and said the only thing I could. "I believe you." She cried then, quietly, and I didn't comfort her, not because I didn't care, but because some wounds have to be felt fully before they can even begin to heal. When she finally left that day, I sat alone in that conference room for almost an hour, staring at the ghost of the woman I had married, the truth of the stranger she had become, and the weight of the men I had fought so hard to rebuild. I didn't know what would come next, if I would forgive her, if she would survive, if any of this could ever be untangled. But for the first time in years, I wasn't holding on to hate like it was the last thing keeping me standing. And that felt like a beginning. After Camille left my office that day, something inside me cracked, not broke, not shattered, just cracked in a way that let the light in. I didn't cry, I didn't drink, I didn't call anyone. I just sat there in silence, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor like time itself was finally giving me space to breathe. I hadn't loved her in a long time, not truly. But hearing she was sick, it stirred something I'd buried under layers of resentment and survival. She was still the woman I once promised to grow old with. And no matter how many mistakes she made, a part of me remembered her laugh in the kitchen on Sundays, or the way she used to squeeze my hand when we were stuck in traffic just to let me know she was there. But I also remembered the courtroom. The smug confidence she wore like perfume, the rehearsed tears. The way she looked right at me as I lost everything, my company, my home, my pride, and didn't even blink. So when I got in my car that night, I didn't go home. I drove out to the old warehouse district where my second business was born. The same business that was now eating away at hers like a controlled demolition, one client, one supplier, one loyal customer at a time. I stood in front of the blueprint wall where I kept every strategic move I'd made over the past 2 years. Every deal I'd landed, every contract I'd flipped from her team to mine. It wasn't just business. It was chess. And I'd been playing with a kind of cold, surgical precision that only heartbreak could create. But now I stood there and felt empty. I had won. And it didn't feel like victory. It felt like ashes. The next morning, I called Natalie into my office. "Schedule a meeting with the legal team," I said. "For what?" she asked, cautiously. "I want to draw up new clauses for our vendor loyalty contracts. And I want to revise our expansion strategy for next quarter. Pull back slightly in their territories." She stared at me, shocked. "You're easing off the pressure?" I nodded. "Why?" And I told her the truth. Because I didn't build this to destroy Camille. I built it to save myself. And I already did that. There was a silence. The kind that fills a room like a deep exhale. "I'll call them," she said quietly, and left. But it wasn't just about business anymore. Something else was nagging at me. Something Camille had said about Anthony, about how he had pushed her, how he convinced her to fight me in court like a war. And suddenly, it all clicked. The late-night messages I intercepted from old clients, the way certain board members on her team had flipped overnight, the anonymous tip I'd received during my rebuild that led me to a critical vendor her company lost. Anthony wasn't just her lover. He was orchestrating her downfall from the inside. I hired a private investigator the next day, someone I trusted, someone who didn't ask too many questions. Within 3 weeks, the report came back. And it was worse than I thought. Anthony had funneled money through fake vendors, overcharged for logistics, undercut key accounts, and set Camille's business up for a collapse. And she had no idea. None. She was sick, tired, and probably too distracted by her guilt to notice the sabotage happening beneath her feet. I sat on that report for 2 days, staring at it like it was a bomb with no timer. And then, finally, I called her. She sounded surprised when she picked up. "Michael. We need to talk," I said. "You sound serious." "I am. Meet me at the old cafe on 7th, tomorrow. 11 a.m. Come alone." She showed up, thinner than before, eyes shadowed with fatigue. But she smiled when she saw me, and I nodded, neutral. We sat by the window, and I slid the folder across the table. "What's this?" "Proof," I said, "that Anthony has been stealing from you." Slowly. Methodically. He's bleeding you out from the inside. She stared at it, confused. What are you talking about? I had him investigated. I didn't plan to, but after what you said, I had to know. She opened the folder and scanned the documents. And I watched the color drain from her face. Shock first, then anger, then something worse. Grief. I trusted him, she whispered. He said he loved me. He probably did, I said, coldly, but he loved your bank account more. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the evidence. I could see the storm building inside her, the betrayal, the shame. It was a mirror of what I had felt once, sitting across from a different betrayal. I can help, I said, and she looked up. What? I can help you clean this up. Not out of love. Not out of pity. But because I don't want your legacy to be built on lies and theft. She blinked rapidly. You do that for me. I do it for the person you used to be. The one who still exists somewhere under all of this mess. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. We met several times over the next few weeks. I introduced her to a forensic accountant, gave her contacts to restructure her contracts. She fired Anthony. Publicly. Loudly. Without hesitation. She still had cancer. Still had battles ahead that no money or power could solve. But at least now, she wasn't alone. And neither was I. One night, we sat in the hospital garden after her third chemo session. It was quiet, just the hum of distant city sounds and the breeze through the trees. Do you ever think we could have made it? She asked. I thought for a long time before answering. Maybe. If we'd both been different people. But we're not. And maybe that's okay. She nodded, leaning her head back, eyes closed. I still dream about you sometimes, she said softly. Yeah. Yeah. Not the men in the courtroom. The men in the kitchen, barefoot, making pancakes at midnight. I smiled. I burned them every time. But you tried, she whispered, and for the first time, there was peace in her voice. That was the night I knew I had finally let go. Not just of her. But of everything. The anger, the need for revenge, the part of me that thought I'd never be whole again. Because I was. Whole. In a way I never expected. And she was still fighting. But at least now, she wasn't fighting alone. The winter came early that year. A quiet kind of winter, not the cruel, biting one that cuts through your coat, but the kind that hangs in the air like an echo. I remember sitting in my office, watching the first snow drift past the window like ash from a fire long burned out. It was peaceful. And for the first time in years, so was I. Camille's business was still standing, just barely. She'd had to sell off one of her warehouses, cut her staff in half, and pull out of 3 cities. But she was fighting now, not out of pride or vanity, but out of something real. And in her worst moments, she never once asked me for money. Only advice. Only presence. That said more than any apology ever could. My own company had grown faster than I ever intended. What started as a personal rebellion had become something powerful, sustainable. And yet, I kept it lean. I hired carefully, expanded slowly. I didn't want an empire. I wanted a life. And that's what I built. One morning in late January, I got a call from Camille's sister. She never called unless it was important. I braced myself before I picked up. And I was right too. She collapsed, she said, barely holding it together. They've moved her to hospice, Michael. It's time. I didn't ask any questions. Didn't hesitate. I just drove. All the way to that quiet little center near the river where they tucked people away when the doctors were done fighting. She looked small. Still beautiful, still Camille, but quieter now, softer. The fire had gone from her voice, replaced by something lighter, like she'd finally stopped holding her breath after years of rage and running. Hey, I said, sitting by her bed. She opened her eyes slowly, and when she saw me, she smiled. Not sadly, not with regret. Just smiled. Like someone who remembered all the good things before they went wrong. I didn't think you'd come, she whispered, voice thin as silk. I always come when it matters, I said, and I meant it. We sat in silence for a while, her hand in mine. I could feel the bones beneath her skin now, like the shell of someone I once knew. But inside she was still that same complicated woman I married. Brilliant, proud, flawed, real. "Do you hate me?" she asked suddenly. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window at the pale sky and thought about all the versions of her I'd known. The girl in the red dress who danced in the rain. The fierce businesswoman who once out-negotiated a Fortune 500 CEO. The wife who forgot anniversaries but remembered every little detail about how I liked my coffee. And yes, the woman who lied, betrayed, took everything I had and called it justice. "No," I finally said. "I don't hate you. I hated what happened. I hated who we became. But hate? No. That's gone now." She closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her cheek. "I'm sorry, Michael. For all of it. Not just the affair or the court or the judge, but for how I stopped seeing you. You gave me everything, and I just took and took until there was nothing left." I squeezed her hand gently. I wasn't perfect either. I stayed too long. I let myself get lost in trying to be the man you needed instead of the man I was meant to be. She smiled again, softer this time. "I loved you, you know. Even when I stopped showing it." "I know," I said, and I did. Maybe that's what hurt the most back then, knowing the love was real, and still watching it fall apart like an avalanche we couldn't stop. She drifted off to sleep, and I sat with her through the night. Just breathing. Just existing beside her. No grand speeches, no dramatic confessions. Just quiet. Just peace. She passed 3 days later. In her sleep. Her sister called me at dawn, and I didn't cry, not then. Not even at the funeral. I stood in the back, away from the eyes of her clients, old colleagues, the few family members who still cared. I let them remember their version of her. And I held on to mine. Afterward, I went back to my office and sat at my desk for a long time. Then I pulled open a drawer and took out the last envelope she had written me. I'd found it at hospice, left in the drawer beside her bed, addressed simply, Michael. Inside was one page. Handwritten. "You were always the stronger one, even when I made you feel small. I thought power meant control, but I was wrong. You had real power, the kind that builds, protects, forgives. I hope you use it now to live. Don't waste another second trying to be what you think the world expects. Just be. I loved you. I hope that's what you remember." I folded the note and tucked it into my wallet. It's still there now, years later. A reminder, not of pain, but of everything we survived. I rebuilt my life. Not in a dramatic way. Not in the movies kind of way where the hero ends up with a trophy wife and a penthouse. I bought a little cabin in Vermont. I wake up early, walk by the lake, drink coffee as the fog lifts. Sometimes I visit old clients, offer free advice to young entrepreneurs trying to avoid the traps I once fell into. I write now, too, quiet stories about business, betrayal, and healing. Nobody knows they're about me. But that's okay. One summer evening, a young man knocked on my cabin door. Tall, polite, nervous. He held out a hand and said, "I think you knew my mother, Camille. I'm her son. From her first marriage." I froze. She never told me about him. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw her fire. And I knew. We sat on the porch for hours that night. He told me everything, how he'd found her letters, how she talked about me in her journals, how she regretted not bringing him into my life. And I told him my side. Not to defend myself, not to rewrite history. Just to tell the truth. He listened. And when I was done, he looked out at the lake and said, "She wasn't perfect. But I'm glad she had someone who saw her, even in the end." We stayed in touch after that. He visits sometimes, asks for advice, shares pictures of his new baby girl, Camille. I smile every time I see them. Not because it makes sense. But because it doesn't have to. Life isn't clean. It's not fair or predictable or wrapped up in neat little bows. But if you hold on long enough, if you let go of what broke you without forgetting what it taught you, you can find peace. Even in the ruins. Even after the fire. Even after the love is gone. And maybe that's all we're ever really looking for in the end. Not revenge, not redemption. Just peace. And for the first time in my life, I have it.